They told you that Moses stood before Pharaoh, that seas split open, that plagues fell from the sky, and that a nation of slaves walked out of Egypt in triumph, led by the hand of God himself. Yet, what if I told you that none of it happened, that the most famous rescue story in the Bible is nothing more than a carefully crafted lie, repeated so many times that it became unquestioned truth, and that by the end of this investigation, you will see how archaeology, history, and even the Bible itself collapse under the weight of this myth. So let us begin where the legend itself begins, with Egypt. Because if 2 million people walked out of Pharaoh's empire in one night, there should be mountains of evidence, traces in ruins, records in temples, references in papyrus scrolls. Yet Egypt remains silent. Not a single word about Hebrews fleeing, not a single scar in the sands to prove this monumental event. And remember, Egypt was obsessed with record-keeping. They carved victories and defeats on temple walls. They recorded taxes, grain storage, even the names of slaves, yet somehow they forgot to mention the greatest slave rebellion in history. Ask yourself why. Because silence is not evidence of conspiracy. Silence is evidence of absence, and the absence here is deafening. And then consider the logistics: 2 million people wandering through the desert for 40 years, leaving no bones, no weapons, no pottery, no campsites. Archaeologists have scoured Sinai, and what they found is nothing. The desert is littered with remains of tiny nomadic tribes, yet not a trace of a massive exodus, and that is impossible to explain if it truly happened. And here is the bitter truth. The exodus is not history, it is theater. It is political propaganda, a story invented centuries later to give a scattered people a shared identity, a tale that told them they were chosen, they were rescued, they had divine destiny. And the shocking part is that even within the Bible, the story contradicts itself. One passage says 600,000 men walked out. Another suggests a tiny clan left. One verse says they wandered 40 years. Another implies just a generation. These contradictions are not innocent mistakes. They are fingerprints of fabrication, the marks left behind by storytellers weaving and rewriting over centuries. And you must stop and ask, why would they need to invent such a story? Why create a fake history of slavery and liberation? The answer is as devastating as it is simple. Because a nation without a past is fragile, but a nation with a divine origin is unbreakable. The Exodus was not about truth, it was about power. And you can see this when you realize the story was not even written anywhere near the time it supposedly happened. Scholars trace the Exodus account to the late kingdom of Judah, hundreds of years after Moses supposedly lived, when priests and scribes were desperate to unify tribes under one God and one law. What better way than to invent a past where their God crushed the mightiest empire on earth? And here is a thought that should shake you. If the Exodus collapses, what else collapses with it? Because Christianity builds on this foundation. Jesus' Last Supper is tied to Passover. The symbolism of liberation is central. So if Exodus is myth, then much of the theological foundation is myth as well. Do you feel the weight of this revelation? Because the church has taught for centuries that without Exodus, there is no chosen people. Without chosen people, there is no covenant. Without covenant, there is no Messiah. And suddenly the entire house of cards trembles. And this is only the beginning. As we move deeper, you will see how archaeology screams against this story, how Egyptian records, desert silence, and even the words of the Bible itself all align to expose it as the greatest biblical lie in history, and yet billions still believe it without question. Is that faith, or is it indoctrination? Pause for a moment and feel the chill of that question, because everything you were taught about Moses may be nothing more than smoke and mirrors. And if the Bible's central history collapses here, can you still trust the rest? The journey is only starting, and the truth will get darker from here. Imagine for a moment that you are an Egyptian scribe, living during the supposed time of Moses. Your job is to record everything that happens in the kingdom, every grain stored, every flood of the Nile, every minor skirmish, because Egypt was a civilization obsessed with memory. Yet somehow you do not write a single word about a mass of Hebrew slaves escaping. You do not write about 10 plagues devastating the land. You do not write about the death of Pharaoh's army swallowed by the sea. This silence is not just suspicious, it is damning, because if such calamities had struck Egypt, they would have left scars in both record and landscape. But there are none, and when archaeologists dig into the time period the Bible places the Exodus in, they find Egypt flourishing, thriving, stable. not reeling from the collapse that such catastrophes would have caused. In fact, the cities supposedly abandoned by fleeing slaves show no sudden depopulation, no collapse in structure. Instead, they show continuity of Egyptian life, grain stores filled, temples functioning, bureaucracy intact. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the entire framework of the Exodus collapses under historical scrutiny, and it goes deeper, because the Bible tells us that the Hebrews built the cities of Pithom and Ramses, yet excavations reveal these cities were constructed centuries after the supposed Exodus, meaning the story places them in a time they did not even exist. Anachronism is one of the clearest fingerprints of myth, someone writing long after the fact, inserting details that betray their distance from real events. And then there is the problem of numbers. The Bible says 600,000 men left Egypt, meaning with women and children around 2 million people. Think about that number. 2 million people marching through the desert. The logistics of food, water, shelter would have been impossible, and such a horde would leave behind mountains of evidence, broken pottery, tools, bones, fire pits. Yet Sinai yields nothing, not even a fraction of what would be expected, and when defenders try to shrink the number to make it more believable, they contradict the very text they claim is divinely inspired. So either the Bible lies, or its defenders must twist it to survive. But truth does not need rescue, only lies do. And then look at the internal contradictions. In one place, the Israelites leave with their flocks and herds. In another, they are suddenly starving and desperate. For manna, in one passage, they wander for 40 years. In another, they enter the land swiftly. These are not seamless historical accounts. They are stitched together myths edited by competing traditions. And that is why modern scholars see Exodus not as history, but as literature. A collection of stories meant to explain identity rather than record fact. And when you compare Exodus with earlier myths, you see striking parallels. Sargon of Akkad's birth story with a baby set adrift in a basket on a river mirrors the story of Moses. Mesopotamian flood myths shape the plagues. Even the wandering in the desert echoes older nomadic traditions. What does that tell you? It tells you the authors of Exodus borrowed, adapted and repackaged myths to craft a new identity for themselves. And here lies the devastating truth: the Exodus was never about preserving memory, it was about creating one. It was never about recording fact, it was about inventing destiny, and the church later used it as the foundation of salvation history. Jesus positioned as the new Moses, the Passover reinterpreted as his sacrifice. So if Exodus falls, then the entire symbolic framework of Christianity loses its anchor. Reflect on this for a moment. What does it mean when billions anchor their lives to a story with no evidence? What does it mean when faith rests on fiction? It means power can be built on lies if people believe them long enough, and that should shake you to the core. Because if they lied about Exodus, what else did they lie about? What other stories are not history but theater? What other foundations of faith are built on sand? Keep watching, because the deeper we go, the more this illusion crumbles, and by the end, you will see how the greatest biblical lie was not just told, it was enforced for centuries as divine truth. Now let us strip away the veil even further, and examine how the Exodus story was not only fabricated, but carefully engineered to serve a political purpose. Because myths are not created in a vacuum, they are born in moments of crisis, rewritten in times of desperation, and used as tools to forge unity where none exists. When scholars dissect the origin of the Exodus narrative, they find that it was not written during the time of Moses at all, if such a man ever existed, but hundreds of years later during the kingdom of Judah, a small struggling state surrounded by empires, threatened by Assyria and Babylon, desperate to carve out a sense of divine destiny. So priests and scribes crafted a story that turned their fragile existence into a cosmic drama. In their version, they were not a minor hill tribe, but the chosen people rescued by the hand of God from the greatest empire on earth. They were not insignificant, but central to history itself. And this is why Exodus matters, because it created the illusion of divine chosenness. And once a people believe they are chosen, they will endure anything, fight anyone, and justify any act as holy. But when you pull back the curtain, you see the same patterns in other cultures. Babylonian myths tell of their god Marduk rescuing them from chaos. Hittite legends describe journeys of people led by gods through wilderness. Every ancient people had their origin myths, but Israel's scribes elevated theirs to history, embedding it into law and a ritual until it became unquestioned, and that is the genius of the fabrication. The Exodus was not just a story, it was institutionalized in Passover, retold every year, drilled into the minds of children until generations later no one doubted it, and then Christianity took this myth and supercharged it, framing Jesus as the new Moses, his crucifixion and resurrection aligned with Passover, to give the illusion that he fulfilled the Exodus cycle. So if Exodus is myth, then the Christian claim that Jesus is the completion of that myth also collapses. Do you see how one lie multiplies into many? One invention becomes the root of centuries of doctrine. But now let us turn to the absence of evidence again, because in archaeology, absence can speak louder than presence. If millions of people had wandered Sinai for decades, they would have left cemeteries, animal bones, broken tools, pottery shards, yet extensive surveys by Israeli archaeologists themselves have revealed nothing. The few sites discovered show small nomadic tribes, dozens of people, not millions. So defenders twist again. Some say maybe God miraculously erased the evidence, but what does that mean? That God planted a story with no proof just to test faith? Or does it mean the story was never true at all? And what kind of God would base salvation on deception? Pause here and feel the weight of that. Because if God's truth requires falsifying history, then what does that say about the very nature of faith? And then, there is the geography. The Bible describes the Israelites stopping at places that did not exist until centuries later, references to Edom and Moab as nations when they were not yet formed, details that reveal the writers were projecting backwards, inserting their current world into an imagined past. The fingerprints of myth are everywhere if you dare to look, and when you do, the story unravels piece by piece. So what you have is not a record of miracles, but a carefully constructed legend, designed to unify, to control, to give identity. And the danger is this: once a people accept a myth as truth, they can be manipulated forever. Because if you can convince them their entire history is divine, you can lead them anywhere. And this is exactly what the priests of Judah did, exactly what later Christian leaders did. They built empires not on fact, but on myth, on stories repeated until no one questioned them. And yet, here you are questioning, feeling that unease rising, wondering if the faith you inherited is a house built on lies. That unease is not doubt, it is awakening. It is the first crack in the walls of illusion. And if you stay with me through this journey, those walls will collapse completely, because the Exodus was never about freedom from Egypt. It was about enslavement to a lie, and that is the truth they never wanted you to see. Let us now confront the most unsettling layer of this deception, the way Exodus was weaponized, not only as a story of identity, but as a tool of domination. Because once you create a myth of chosenness, you create a myth of exclusion. Once you claim God liberated you from Egypt, you claim he condemned your enemies. And this narrative gave priests and kings the authority to declare wars, seize lands, and subjugate others, all in the name of divine will. The conquest stories in Joshua flow directly from Exodus, portraying Canaan not as an inhabited land full of diverse peoples, but as a promised land waiting to be seized, and that seizure justified by the claim that God himself had ordained it. Yet archaeology again demolishes this, because Jericho, the city supposedly brought down by trumpets after the Exodus, was not even standing in the time frame the Bible places it. Its walls had already been destroyed centuries earlier, meaning the conquest is as much fabrication as the Exodus itself. But why tell such lies? Why craft such violent myths? Because myth is power, and Exodus was the cornerstone of a theology that legitimized conquest, exclusion, and hierarchy, later echoed in Christianity when Jesus is presented as the new Moses leading people out of bondage, not from Egypt this time, but from sin. Yet the structure is the same, a fabricated liberation story giving legitimacy to a new religious order, and here is where the emotional weight hits hardest. If Exodus collapses, then much of what Christians believe about their Savior's mission collapses with it. The symbolism of Passover becomes hollow. The Last Supper loses its prophetic weight. The very idea of divine rescue fades. And this is why defenders fight so hard to protect the myth, because if the Exodus falls, the house of faith trembles. But you must ask yourself, why does truth need defending? If it is truth, should it not stand on its own? Yet every defense of Exodus is riddled with excuses, shrinking numbers, moving dates, inventing miracles that erase evidence, twisting words to keep the story alive. But that is not how truth behaves. That is how lies survive. And the deeper you look, the more the contradictions scream out. And then there is the psychological manipulation. Because Exodus was embedded in ritual, Passover became the annual reenactment of deliverance, a way of binding generations emotionally to a fabricated history. And this technique of repeating myths through ritual is one of the most powerful forms of indoctrination, and Christianity adopted it wholesale. The Eucharist becomes a new Passover, retelling a new Exodus every week, cementing belief through repetition until no one questions its origins. But here you are questioning, realizing that what has been presented as sacred memory may be nothing more than sacred theater. And this is not an easy realization. It is a painful one, because it means millions of lives, wars, rituals, and personal sacrifices were built on fiction. Yet it is better to live in pain with truth than in comfort with lies. And here is the sharpest cut. If Exodus never happened, then the God who claimed to orchestrate it never acted, which means for centuries, people worshipped a silence, prayed to an invention, submitted their lives to a narrative crafted by scribes with political motives. And that realization is devastating, but it is also liberating, because once you see the lie for what it is, you are no longer bound by it, and you begin to see how much of faith itself has been shaped, not by divine revelation, but by human invention. And this is the turning point, because the question now is not whether Exodus happened. The evidence shows it did not. The question is, what happens to faith when the foundation crumbles? Will you cling to illusion, or will you face the truth? The truth that the Exodus is not history, but the greatest biblical lie in history, designed to control, preserved to dominate, and believed because no one dared to ask the hard questions until now, but you dared, and that means you are already free from the chains of myth. And now we arrive at the crushing conclusion, the final blow to the story that billions still cling to, because when you gather all the evidence together, the verdict is undeniable. The Exodus never happened, not as history, not as fact. It exists only as myth, born from the imagination of scribes centuries after the supposed events, crafted not to record memory, but to invent identity. And once you realize this, the implications ripple across the entire biblical narrative, because without Exodus, there is no covenant at Sinai, no tablets of law given by God's own hand, no divine liberation that proves Israel was chosen. Without Exodus, the prophets lose their foundation. The rituals of Passover are exposed as reenactments of a fiction, and the theology of Christianity itself loses its prophetic anchor, because Jesus being the new Moses only makes sense if Moses was real. Jesus being the fulfillment of Exodus only carries weight if Exodus ever happened. But it did not, and that means one of the pillars propping up Christianity is hollow, and you can feel the weight of that truth, a weight that terrifies religious leaders because it reveals centuries of manipulation, centuries of power built on lies. But the silence of Egypt speaks louder than any sermon. The emptiness of Sinai shouts louder than any hymn. The contradictions of Scripture scream louder than any priest. And when you listen closely, you realize the entire story collapses under its own weight. And here is the most haunting thought. If Exodus was invented to unify and control, then what does that mean about the rest of the Bible? What does it mean about the Gospels, about the crucifixion, about the resurrection? Are these also myths reframed as history, illusions repeated until they became unquestioned truths? Because history shows us that once you accept one grand lie, you are prepared to accept another, and faith becomes not about truth, but about loyalty to the story, even if the story is false. So the choice now rests with you. Do you remain loyal to a myth, or do you embrace the liberating but uncomfortable truth that the Exodus was the greatest biblical lie in history? And here is the final reflection. For centuries, people have bowed their heads at Passover tables. Churches have raised their voices in hymns. Nations have justified wars, all rooted in a story that never happened. And yet the power of that story shaped the world. That is the danger of lies repeated long enough. They become more powerful than truth itself. But now you see the deception exposed and you cannot unsee it. So the question is no longer whether Moses led an exodus. The question is whether you will let yourself be led by lies or finally set free by truth. Because real freedom does not come from escaping Egypt. It comes from escaping illusion. And that is the journey you began the moment you dared to ask, was Moses real? Did Exodus happen? Or was it all a lie? And now you know, it was a lie. The greatest, Biblical lie in history. And if this revelation shook you, imagine the truth still hidden in plain sight waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe so you do not miss the next revelation, because every story they told you has another side, and it is time you finally heard it.